Good morning, everyone. I want to start by thanking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their tremendous leadership in this effort. As we've said from the very beginning of this is not a Democratic or a Republican idea. It's just the right idea for all the brave men and women that serve in our military. I want to thank this brave group of supporters who are making their voices heard, urging Congress to take its oversight role head on by finally creating an independent military justice system that will give survivors of horrific acts of sexual violence a fair shot at justice, a system free of the inherent biases and conflicts of interest that currently exist within the chain of command that will enable our survivors to come forward and hold their assailants accountable. This critically needed reform isn't going to succeed just because of the people standing here today. It will succeed because of the strong and growing bipartisan coalition of senators, advocates, veterans, retired generals, and commanding officers who are showing that this is not a partisan issue and it's not an ideologic issue. It is a pro-military piece of reform that will enhance our military readiness. This coming Monday, we will observe Veterans Day and honor America's best and brightest, brave men and women who join the armed services for all the right reasons, to serve our country, to defend all that we hold sacred, and to make our military the best in the world, the best the world has ever known. These men and women put everything on the line to defend our country and our values. Each time they're called into service, they answer the call. But too often, these brave men and women are in the fight of their life, and it is not on some far-off foreign soil. It's right within their own ranks, with their commanding officer, as victims of horrific acts of sexual violence. We're here today to hear from some of our strongest leaders and advocates on this issue, who have endured these acts, who have witnessed these acts, and can speak firsthand. Sexual assault in the military is not new. It has been allowed to fester in the shadows for far too long. Instead of the zero tolerance pledge that we have now heard for over 2 decades, going back to when the Secretary of Defense was Dick Cheney, first using those words in 1992, what we really have today is zero accountability. There is no accountability because the trust that any justice is possible has been irreparably broken under the current system where commanders hold all the cards as to whether a case will move forward or not. Critics say moving these decisions out of the chain of command will diminish good order and discipline. Well, I have news for you. With 26,000 cases of sexual assault, rape, and unwanted sexual contact last year alone, we don't have the good order and discipline that our military needs. The truth is, our bipartisan bill is carefully crafted to leave the 37 serious crimes that are unique to the military within the chain of command, such as insubordination or going absent without leave, in addition to all the crimes punishable by less than 1 year of confinement, the punishment that is under Article 15. And let me be very clear. Nothing in this bill allows commanders off the hook. In fact, they are the only ones responsible for good order and discipline, for maintaining a command climate that makes sure these rapes and assaults don't happen, for maintaining the command climate that allows the victims to come forward and to know she can have justice, and to make sure that when he or she does come forward, she is not retaliated against. They don't have to make one legal decision to do that job. And if listening to our victims' voices and advocates' voices are not enough, listen then to the retired generals, the commanders, the JAG officers, and the veterans who know from years of experience that our approach is the right way forward. Just this September, more than 3 retired generals gave their public support of this proposal, including Lieutenant General Claudia Kennedy, the first woman to reach the rank of a 3-star general in the U.S. Army, Brigadier General Lori Sutton, formerly the highest-ranking psychiatrist in the U.S. Army, and Brigadier General David McGinnis, who is standing here with us today. The same week, a key Defense Department panel that Secretary Hagel said he places a great premium on voted overwhelmingly in support of these decisions from the chain of command. This committee is the preeminent committee that advises the Secretary of Defense on the status of women in the military. This committee has been impaneled for 50 years. They've been studying this issue for decades. There is no committee that knows more about this issue than them. 10 members of the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services voted in support of our proposal. 6 abstained, 0 voted against. Just yesterday, we also had additional evidence coming forward. We've had SWAN, the Service Women's Action Network, the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the Vietnam Veterans of America, all released an open letter to Congress saying, quote, "We want to be clear. A vote for the Military Justice Improvement Act is a vote for our troops. It is a vote for a stronger military." And if listening to our advocates, our generals, and our veterans still isn't enough, well, why don't we listen to the current commanders who have already told us publicly, in hearings, in speeches, that the current system has failed. Commandant of the Marine Corps, General James Amos, stated earlier this year, victims do not come forward because, quote, they don't trust us. They don't trust the chain of command. They don't trust the leadership. Or listen to the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dempsey, who said that the military is sometimes, quote, too forgiving. In these cases, admitting the bias in the system toward decorated officers. It's time to restore this trust. It's time to move the sole decision-making power over whether serious crimes have taken place, akin to a felony in the civilian system, out of the chain of command and into the hands of trained military prosecutors who are trained to weigh the evidence and make the judgment about whether a crime has been committed and there's enough evidence to go forward. So as we honor our solemn commitment to America's veterans next week, let's remember the veterans who too often live in the shadows, survivors of sexual assault, let down by the military that we hold so dear. These brave men and women that we send to war, we have an obligation to them to keep them safe. By standing here together with this common purpose, that is what we are fighting for today. And it's not surprising that the opponents of our bill, who are trying to protect the current broken system, want to ensure that a majority of the Senate is not enough. Americans are tired of these kind of political games, and our men and women in uniform deserve better. From the beginning, we've all worked to get every vote in the Senate, and we are hopeful that the voices of our greatest advocates and this bipartisan coalition will ultimately be heard, whatever the vote threshold is. Now, I'd like to introduce Senator Chuck Grassley.
I think you've heard it all, and there's not much more that needs.
I'm sorry that was so long.
No.
I did not read it before.
I didn't say that to detract from what you said. I was trying to emphasize how important this issue is, and you've said it all from that standpoint. But I do want you to know why I'm here. But first of all, thank you, Senator Gillibrand, for your leadership. My colleagues who are here of both political parties, and you folks that have come forth to put a human face on this issue. I thank you all very much for being here. Sexual assault cases should be handled outside the chain of command to eliminate bias and make victims more comfortable in coming forward. It's common sense, but more importantly, it's just. Sexual assault is a law enforcement issue. When young adults commit to serving their country and defending our freedoms, they deserve to know their own rights will be protected, including access to justice. This reform will strengthen morale. So I look forward to working for passage of this very important reform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Barbara Boxer.
I'm so proud to be here, Senator Gillibrand, with you and with this amazing coalition of senators, and there are more of us. There is only one fundamental change that will ensure that decisions to prosecute cases of sexual assault will be based on evidence, not on any other factor, and that is this bipartisan Gillibrand Military Justice Improvement Act. Anyone who believes in justice, and I would hope it is all of us, must believe that evidence is all that matters. Objective evidence is all that matters. Shocking comments from Joanne Rooney, the nominee to be Undersecretary of the Navy, clearly show why we must pass this bipartisan bill. Here's what she says. Listen to me when I read it. It proves that evidence is not the standard currently used. Listen to what she says. Quote, a judge advocate outside the chain of command, and that's what we call for, a judge advocate outside the chain of command will be looking at a case through a different lens than a military commander. And she goes on, I believe the impact would be decisions based on evidence rather than the interest in preserving good order and discipline. You know, every once in a while, someone without trying to says something that's absolutely true. And Dr. Rooney is right. This bill will make sure decisions to prosecute serious crimes are based on evidence. That's all it does, in a very smart way. Now, I want you to imagine a situation in a corporation. Let's say there's a big corporate building. The CEO is in his office. He has 1,000 employees, and he finds out there's been a rape in the building. Can you imagine if he is the one to decide whether to bring charges? Perhaps it's against one of his favorite employees. Of course, you can't even imagine it, because we have a system of justice in the civilian world that would never allow that. And that's all we're asking for. On these charts, I have 20 years' worth of promises. 20 years' worth of promises from Republicans, from Democrats. They all say the same thing, and I won't go through it. But the writing's too small, so you can come up here afterward. But all of them say, I will enforce a strict policy, zero tolerance. It goes on and on for more than 20 years now. I was in the House during the tailhook scandal way back 20 years ago. And I remember all of those promises. And honestly, I thought this would never happen again. I really thought the military would live up to his promises. Well, they're empty promises. So I'm going to end with a story of one of my constituents, Stacy Thompson, a Marine Corps veteran and a mother of 3 from Southern California. I stood next to her, just as I'm standing next to her, brave survivor. Stacy was drugged, brutally raped by a male sergeant in 1999 while stationed in Okinawa, Japan. She bravely reported the rape to her superiors, but her allegations were swept under the rug. While her attacker was allowed to leave the Marine Corps without ever facing a court-martial, Stacy became the target of a drug investigation. From the night she was raped, she also was drugged, so they turned against her, and she was forced out of the Marine Corps with an other than honorable discharge. We owe it to survivors like Stacy to end this cycle of broken promises. We owe it to Stacy and others to fix our broken system. And I thank the senator from New York for her work, and we will fight hard to get this done.
Thank you, Barbara. That's beautiful. Our next speaker is U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski.
Kristen, thank you. Senator Gillibrand, thank you for your leadership on this. Senator Boxer, you speak of the story of Stacy. The problem for too many of us is that we have all heard similar stories like Stacy's, like the story that Ariana will share today. The notion that somehow or other our military has addressed this issue of sexual assault within the military because they're saying the right words. Because, as has been pointed out, we've got a commitment to zero tolerance here. And I have heard it, and I think my colleagues have heard it from every single general that has chosen to visit within the past 6 months, that we We've had our eyes wide open. Well, they've had their eyes wide open now for 20 years. And instead of seeing a change in the attitude, a change in the direction, so that we do not have survivors standing up in front of us or quietly writing letters saying, please, can't you do something to affect real change? Because the words aren't solving the problem. In many of the letters that have been received, as a member who's working to address these changes and working with Senator Gillibrand on this, they use terminology like this has been a persistent problem. Brigadier General Sutton describes it as a sorrowful history of inattention and ineptitude, inadequate response to sexual assault, a history of lack of sincerity within the Department of Defense. DOD's time to solve the problem on its own has expired. There's a recognition that we're not talking about something that is current. This is an historical problem, a historical tragedy that needs to be rectified. It needs to be corrected. And it is a shakeup. And Senator Gillibrand, thank you for working so aggressively to shake it up, because the words have not helped the survivors. We're standing before you as members of Congress who will be engaged in some pretty good debate about this, hopefully next week. But our job is easy compared to those who have had to suffer the tragedy of a sexual assault and then suffer the further ongoing tragedy when within a system that they volunteered to honor and defend, they are being treated as the guilty one. We have to make these changes. Thank you.
Thank you, well said. Thank you. Oh, sure. Oh, somebody's recorder's lost their battery. Sorry. It's falling out. You're not going to record anything with that. Our next speaker is U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal.
Thank you to Senator Gillibrand for speaking so eloquently and powerfully, not only today, but really from the very start of this debate. And I want to thank the United States military, because I believe that overwhelmingly the men and women who serve us today in uniform are really just find this crime abhorrent. It's unprofessional and unacceptable to them. And I speak as a dad of 2 sons in the military, knowing that the officers and enlisted men today support drastic and strong action to deal with this problem. But I also want to speak as someone who has been involved in law enforcement for decades. These crimes cannot be proved without trust and cooperation from survivors and victims. What we're seeing today is those survivors coming forward in increasing numbers because the hope of a change in the system is there. And prosecutors will be better able to prosecute and deter and prevent these crimes if trust and confidence in the system is enhanced and sustained. And that's why this change is so important. The underreporting of sexual assaults in the military is perhaps the greatest barrier to preventing them in the first place. The epidemic that we see right now, and let's face it, it is a problem of monstrous magnitude, is due in part to the fact that we know more today about the numbers of cases that are happening. And the military is facing this problem because of those facts and because survivors now are speaking truth to power with a trust and confidence that did not exist before. if nothing else, this change will move forward that trend, and that's part of the reason it's so important. Now, I recognize that the military's leadership has closed ranks against the reform that we're proposing and is presenting a united front. I think in just a short time from now, 5 or 10 years, the military will thank us for taking these decisions away from the chain of command and putting them in the hands of trained, experienced prosecutors who can make these tough decisions and who can prosecute more effectively because they have cooperation from witnesses and they have more effective evidence, and they will make decisions based on the evidence, not on good order and discipline, not on the expertise of the defendant, but on whether a crime has occurred and it can be proved in the court of justice. So I am hopeful in the military courts we will see a recognition, and in the military in general, of the merits of this proposal. We are so close in terms of the numbers of votes. The remaining gap is a fraction of the Senate, and I'm hopeful that we can close that gap in the remaining days with the powerful leadership that we've had from Senator Gillibrand and the truly bipartisan coalition that we have today. In my short time, admittedly short time in the Senate, I have not seen an idea amass this much support from both political parties so overwhelmingly on any cause before this one. So I'm very proud to be here today, and thank you.
Our next speaker is Senator Rand Paul.
You know, in a Washington full of petty partisanship, sniping, and personal attacks and innuendo, this crusade for justice is a welcome breath of fresh air. And I call it a crusade because this isn't about passing a bill or having your name on a bill. This is something that I believe Senator Gillibrand is leading as a crusade for justice, and that's different than passing a bill. To me, it's as simple as this. Should you have to report to your boss when you've been abused or when you've been a victim of a crime? Nowhere in America would you report that to your boss. You report that to the authorities. This would still be within the military, but these should be people who are objectively looking at the law and who will try to find justice. People say, oh, the military's going to fix this. Well, as Senator Boxer said, they've been saying that for a couple of decades. They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The time's come for this. The momentum is building. I predict Senator Gillibrand, because of her tireless crusade, is going to win, and I want to associate that because I think it's a crusade for justice. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Senator Mazie Hirono.
Thank you. I'm proud to stand here with this bipartisan group of supporters, and as Senator Rand said, at a time when there is so much that divides us, to see a group of bipartisan members of the Senate come together on an issue as important as this, it is a big deal. So the crime of sexual assault in the military is a horrific crime, and bias and conflict of interest should have absolutely no part in the decision to prosecute. You're going to hear powerful stories from people who are survivors of this kind of crime in the military, including today from Ariana and Ben. Just a few weeks ago, when I was going home to Hawaii, I was sitting next to a young woman who I found out is a wounded warrior. And when she was in active duty, she commanded a group of soldiers, some 600 of them, including one young woman, she said, who was the most just so positive, always smiling, just wanting to serve. And over time, this young woman stopped smiling, stopped being the positive, enthusiastic soldier that she was in the beginning, and this commander coaxed it out of her. What's going on in your life? She was reluctant to reveal, but it turned out that the NCO was coming into the rooms of the women as they were changing without knocking. So you can see that this kind of sexual harassment and other kinds of sexual assaults go on. And when the commander, the female commander that I was sitting next to, reported this to her chain of command, the only thing that happened was the NCO was removed from that battalion. And that was it. There's no place in the military that prides itself on good order and discipline to allow this kind of crime to continue. And we are affecting the young men and women who join our forces simply to serve. And for them to be exposed to this kind of behavior, you can only imagine what it does to their desire to serve. It just kills them. And this is why I know that what we're doing, this kind of change, is going to help millions of young people who are entering our service over the years. Mahalo.
Our next speaker is U.S. Senator Ted Cruz.
Thank you very much. I want to commend Senator Gillibrand for her tireless, passionate, and effective leadership on this issue. We would not be where we are today if it were not for her willingness to lead this fight. I am proud to support the Gillibrand legislation. I supported it in committee, and I'm proud to support it on the floor of the Senate because I believe it will advance justice and it will strengthen our military. The process that has worked out in terms of developing this bill is the way I think the Senate should work. We should look at facts and evidence, and we should solve and work to solve serious problems. In the Armed Services Committee, we had extensive hearings looking at the persistent problem of sexual assault in our military. And this is a problem that our commanders, our generals, our admirals have worked in good faith, have worked diligently to address. And yet, tragically, it remains. It remains a problem that we have not yet been able to solve. And I can tell you, for me in the Armed Services Committee, what convinced me to support this legislation was two things. Number one, despite the good faith, persistent effort of our military commanders, sexual assault and rape has occurred at unacceptable levels, and the reporting numbers in particular remain persistently low. This is a problem on the civilian side, but it's been an even greater problem in the military side of those who are victims of sexual assault being unwilling, unable to come forward and report that attack. And secondly, was the data from our allies, nations like Great Britain, like Canada, like Israel, who have likewise removed the decision on whether to prosecute these sorts of crimes and put them in the hands of impartial, objective military prosecutors, still within the military, but focused on issues of justice. And our allies, when they've implemented these changes, have seen increases in the reporting rates. In my view, all of us owe a solemn obligation to the men and women of our military. And as the Supreme Court has observed, short of murder, rape is the ultimate violation of self. For any young soldier to be subjected to sexual assault or rape is utterly unacceptable. And I am encouraged that we can see a bipartisan coalition come together and say, let's strengthen the military and make sure we can protect every young man, every young woman who is stepping forward to defend our nation, to defend our liberties.
Hasn't joined. Our next speaker is Ben Clay. He served on active duty in the Marines from 2003 to 2007 and was a reservist in 2011. He's testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee about his expertise on the military's mishandling of sexual offenses based on his time in the Marines. He has had 2 combat deployments. Ben Clay.
When I first met my wife in 2007, she loved the Marine Corps and put it above herself. Her deployment to Iraq reinforced this, and she worked nonstop. When she checked into a new command in 2009, everything changed. From the first day, she felt disappointment and concern about the atmosphere. From there, I watched her fall into depression from the ill treatment months before the assault happened. And in its aftermath, I learned how our military is not organized to address sexual assault. As you've heard, it gives commanders who do not have an interest in proving the worst failures of their commands the authority to decide whether those failures happened. They cannot be impartial, nor can those who work for them be. The first step to addressing sexual assault in the military is to remove its prosecution from the chain of command. It is unfair to expect commanders to be able to maintain good order and discipline as long as their justice system incentivizes and empowers them to deny their unit's worst disciplinary failures ever happened. When Ariana reported her assault, I learned how this denial works. I read her commander's conclusions in writing that she deserved ill treatment for wearing running shorts and makeup. I read the opinion of the command-appointed investigator, who compared rape to prostitution or marrying a rich man. As for the assault trial, it put Ariana through over 15 hours of degrading testimony after a year of retaliation and intimidation. The closing statement of that trial was a Marine officer reading the definition of cunt, slut, and whore. When I arrived to testify, I was seated in a waiting room with one of the rapists, whom the Marine Corps had granted immunity so he could testify that he and his accomplice were innocent. When I finally got to testify, not a single question was asked that would have helped prosecute. Not a single question about the day of the assault or its effects on my wife. When I asked why, I was told that would be distracting to the court. That is what the entire process felt like, a distraction. And it is organized to be that way. Military justice is a secondary duty for a commander, something he didn't sign up for, and a distraction from his mission to fight wars. Imagine a business executive who runs a company and has to oversee the prosecution of felons who perform valuable work for him. He'd be as interested in prosecuting as commanders are, and his workers would be confident about what they could get away with. I used to feel a commander's disinterest in the law too. During my training and deployments in Iraq, I focused on fighting. My life and those of my Marines depended on it. Legal issues were divisive, tore up units, they were distracting and confusing. They made me resent those who brought them to my attention and feel bias as strong as my relationships with those involved. Commanders can be forgiven for thinking war is their most important job, and it should be expected that they'll manage their judicial process as a sideshow and an annoyance. Our laws should not put them in that position, nor should their troops have to bear the injustice that results. Even an alleged terrorist on U.S. soil has greater legal protection than a U.S. Marine. I watched the effect of that injustice on Ariana. It takes incredible strength to pull out of that nightmare. And I'm lucky I married someone so strong to do it, that she could do it, even if she still suffers and has never been the same. She gained wisdom, figured out how to forgive, and though the experience changed her, she refused to let it prevent her from giving her best to her life and those around her. She has a great job and a new career, worked full-time while completing her master's degree, and became a national-level fitness competitor. Do not challenge her to a race. You will be disappointed in yourself. I've never seen her smarter or stronger than now. But she never should have had to learn the lesson she did, and the military still hasn't learned it. We don't think about the most important of these lessons because as Americans, they're so basic to our DNA. The idea that justice should be independent and impartial is one of the foundational principles of our government. Our troops deserve its protection. And when we don't protect them, we have not only a justice problem, but a national security problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Our next speaker is Ariana Clay. She's our greatest champion and our greatest leader. She's a former Marine, assigned to the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. She graduated with honors from the U.S. Naval Academy in 2006 and subsequently served in Iraq. Ariana.
I went to the Naval Academy and joined the Marine Corps because I saw service as a platform to both use my talents and challenge myself to be my potential. I met many courageous service members, served in great commands, and worked with some of our country's finest, most inspiring leaders. I loved the Naval Academy, loved being a Marine, and still feel proud of my service and my command service in Iraq. I trusted and had confidence in my leadership, and that was based on several years of great experiences. That changed in 2009 when I was transferred to a command where harassment was common and condoned. My commander was handicapped from taking action to fix the problem because of his favoritism towards those of higher rank or of combat arms. His incentives were as much to deny the problem as they were to retaliate against those who might choose to report. Despite systemic limitations against passing unbiased judgment, my commander did have the power to deny the presence of harassment. His authority gave him ownership of the truth, yet without accountability. He decided, in writing, that calling officers sluts and whores was not harassment, and that any harassment was deserved because of what I wore or that I'd complained about it. It was the retaliation and condoning of harassment that I believe made those who harmed me feel protected and encouraged. To get out of this climate, after 6 months, I sought and received a binding request to deploy to Afghanistan. My command denied my request 4 times, under the rationale that I was too critical to the command, only 6 months before I was assaulted. A culture of harassment encourages a predator, silences and intimidates his prey, and aids in a command's cover-up. When I reported the assault, my command responded with retaliation. The retaliation is the same in almost every case of sexual assault. Command appointed attempts to diagnose those who report with a personality disorder by officials with no medical training whatsoever. Commanders appointing and rewarding their senior female military members to participate in the retaliation, and command issued protective orders against the accused, ostracism, intimidation, and isolation. The humiliation of the retaliation was worse than the assault, because it was sanctioned from those same leaders I once would have risked my life for. All the policies, programs, and posters against assault added to this, as powerless tokens that only made the humiliation more official. I've worked hard not to let the atrocious acts dominate my otherwise positive military experience, nor define me. To continue to harbor my pain would be disrespectful to myself and my family. So as much as possible, I've chosen to put my energy into constructive solutions. To give my best to all pursuits, the same reasons I joined the Marine Corps, I had to forgive both the perpetrators and those who retaliated against me. And to forgive, I had to understand the system that failed them. Our laws ask the military to do the impossible. It is impossible to expect justice and a legal system run primarily by commanders with no legitimate legal training who have a vested interest in the outcome of their proceedings and an undeniable favoritisms that are only human nature. But that is how America, unique among our allies, runs military justice. As long as that is the case, predators in the military will continue to feel protected, victims will not come forward, and commanders will follow their natural instincts to disbelieve and crush accusations of their command's worst failures. I was recently invited to speak with some of our nation's most senior commanders at U.S. Central Command. It was clear to me by their insightful discussion and time spent on the issue, they have good intentions. But it's unfair to the commanders that our government asks them to maintain discipline, yet puts them in a position which requires them to defy natural human bias in order to succeed. We need laws to set up our commanders for success. We would not expect a commander to ask for outside supervision, yet we know impartiality cannot exist within a command. We owe impartiality to our troops, harmed or accused, and we owe it to their commanders to free their time so they can do what they do best, train ready forces, win our nation's wars, and protect our freedom. I often tell Ben I don't see myself as a victim or a survivor. I see myself as a leader and an advocate for change, although I did experience sexual assault in the military. And that's one of my main points, that by allowing sexual assault prosecutions to remain within the chain of command, we are losing exactly the kind of service member that the military is trying to recruit.
Our next speaker is Nancy Duff Campbell, co-president of the National Women's Law Center.
Thank you. It's hard to follow such powerful speech. My written statement has the details of why the National Women's Law Center so strongly supports the Military Justice Improvement Act. And I want to thank all the senators here and all of the other senators who have thus far publicly announced their support for this important legislation. Just want to make a few points. First, as Senator Gillibrand said, this is not a radical idea. It was carefully crafted with expert advice from many different people, and it will not only improve our nation's military justice system, but in our belief, it will encourage more victims of sexual assault and probably other crimes to come forward and report those crimes within the military. As others have said, until perpetrators believe that they will be held accountable for their actions, we are not going to get a grip on this problem. And until victims and survivors of sexual assault believe that the system will treat them fairly, they are not going to report these assaults. So it is a continuous circle. And if we do not improve the system, we will not improve the confidence of survivors. And we will not really be able to deter and stop these heinous crimes. So what should we do? The bill has been described very well by Senator Gillibrand and others. It is an independent, objective, and non-biased system that we need for our military justice in order to instill this confidence in the system. The main arguments against the legislation, as others have said, is that removing the prosecution of these crimes from the chain of command will reduce the commander's authority to ensure good order and discipline in his or her command. But there are commanders, we should remember, who do not have convening authority for court-martials, and yet that has not prevented them from ensuring good order and discipline in their commands. And in fact, over time, since the inception of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the responsibilities of commanders have changed. We used to give commanders the authority, for example, to handle family conflicts, disputes within a family, a dispute that a mother was having with a child that might have had reverberations in the command. But now we've recognized that these kinds of decisions about what to do should be given to experts, and those are handled by social workers, not by commanders. So this, again, is not a radical piece of legislation. And what this legislation does is the same as has been done in other instances with commanders. Turn over to the legal experts the responsibility for making legal decisions. Why do we ask commanders who typically don't have legal training to make legal decisions, especially when there are potentially serious consequences for all concerned when they make the wrong decision? This is like asking a commander without flight training to fly a fighter jet, or a commander without medical training to perform surgery. We just don't do it. Why do we do it here? Equally important, particularly when it comes to sexual assault, there are critical areas in which a commander has expertise that can and should be brought to bear. Again, others have noted these. Having a good command climate, fighting wars. There are important things that commanders need to do and have expertise in. And this is a distraction from that, and unfortunately, a distraction that has serious consequences. Instead, commanders can model the behavior that they expect from those they command. This is the leadership job that commanders should be called upon to do, and how they can address the issue of sexual assault in their command. And finally, if these were radical changes, it's unlikely that they would have been recommended by the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, known affectionately as DACOWITS, which was established 62 years ago to advise the Secretary of Defense on issues affecting women in the armed services. This committee, on which I serve, has a long and distinguished history of recommendations that have resulted in important policy and legal changes in the military. In September, as Senator Gillibrand said, DACOWITS recommended that the Defense Department support legislation to remove from the chain of command the prosecution of military, I want to quote it exactly, prosecution of military crimes involving military cases involving serious crimes, except crimes that are uniquely military in nature and place that responsibility in the hands of military personnel with legal expertise and experience who are outside the chain of command of the victim and the accused. I should add that all but one of the Dakowitz members who voted for this recommendation are prior members of the United States military, and 40% of them are flag officers, generals, or admirals. To ensure a strong military justice system that is essential to preventing sexual assault and other serious crimes, and to make decision-making in the military on legal matters more independent, less biased, more transparent in many ways, we need to pass the Military Justice Improvement Act. The National Women's Law Center urges all senators to support the inclusion of this important legislation in the 2014 NDAA. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Brigadier General retired David L. McGinnis, former Principal Deputy to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs, U.S. Department of Defense, appointed by President Obama.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. I'm going to be pretty short. I agree with everything that was said. I'm here to tell you that this legislation will improve the good order and discipline of our military. I have no doubt about that. I have commanded at a number of levels, both on active duty, in combat, and in the National Guard. I've also had the responsibility for developing leaders, officers and non-commissioned officers. And everything that's been said here so far as part of the problem is true. And the ability of the culture to adjust isn't going to happen overnight. I remember General Creighton Abrams, who guided the Army out of the Vietnam debacle and brought it forward, said, when asked, how much change can you do, Abe, in your 4 years as Chief of Staff? Unfortunately, was cut short by cancer. He said, 1 degree on the azimuth. I'm also reminded of since I took the oath 48 years ago to defend the Constitution, I started learning about it. And I also understand where the power to regulate the military exists, ladies and gentlemen. And so I'm not too concerned with the fact that all the military leaders stood up in a couple hearings and said they're against this. They can give their advice. But I can also tell you that I also speak through colleagues and also through personal contact with a lot of the middle leaders of our military. And they don't like it either. I can reinforce that and support those statements that were made earlier. So I compliment this effort. I support the leadership of the senator from New York, which is my home state, even though I now live in Virginia. And thank you very much, all of you, for adding to this effort.
We're prepared to take on-topic questions right now. From my perspective, her testimony on this issue is prohibitive. She said the reason why she doesn't like this approach is because she doesn't want these cases decided on the evidence, and that's an unacceptable answer. When given the chance to clarify her answer, she not only doubled down, but she said there are a lot of considerations besides evidence, such as morale. So in her view, if the perpetrator is more popular, more important to her unit, better valued, then it's okay not to prosecute. That's unacceptable.
Well, I fully agree. I'm shocked by what she said, and given the chance to retract it, she did not. So who wants to put someone in a position of power who thinks it's just fine to ignore the evidence in a sexual assault case? It really, it sickened me. And it really, in many ways, is the best way we can prove to America and to our colleagues that Kirsten Gillibrand